Hi there, and welcome to the IWSCC podcast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deidre Guy, and I am the founder of the Inclusive Workplace and Supply Council of Canada, which is a certifying council that certifies companies that are owned at least 51% owned, operated, and controlled by either someone with a disability, one or more people with a disability, or one or more veterans. And of course, often those two intersect. So I'm really pleased today to have you here. Our video, if you happen to be watching on YouTube, you'll see that we have ASL interpretation, and that is brought to you by Maple Communications Canada. And thank you so much to Remote Video for our production of this podcast today. I'm so excited to introduce to you and to myself, actually, someone that I met recently by the name of Bradley Sheppard. We are just chit-chatting. He is a veteran and interested in the idea of becoming certified with the IWSCC. And when we talked in depth about what some of the things that he does with his company, I was just blown away and thought, okay, we need to have him on our podcast so we can learn about what he does and the experiences that he's got. So thank you so much for being here, Bradley. I really appreciate it. And I guess we'll just jump right in and get started. So who is Bradley Sheppard, and what is it that you do right now?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Who is Bradley Sheppard? Bradley Sheppard, I'm from Whitney Pear, which is a cultural mosaic or a melting pot community located in Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. So I'm at the very far east coast of this beautiful country. And I've been born and raised here, so I've lived here my whole life and was lucky enough to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces for a number of years as a combat engineer. And so with that experience, or with that position, I was traveled all over the place. I've done a lot of interesting things, helped and met a lot of interesting people. And, you know, it's kind of those skills I acquired along the way, both in the Army and in post-secondary, and taking those skills and kind of wanting to give back and wanting to add service. And so that's where the DEI training comes in. And so I've been fortunate enough to be working with multiple community partners over the last number of years, talking about things that matter in the workplace. And a lot of those things we call part of the safety net or the safe space. So they include diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it also involves self-awareness. It involves emotional intelligence, leadership, things of that nature. So I'm glad I get a chance to help people, and I'm glad that I get to meet people like you.
Yeah, I was really happy to meet you as well. I'm looking forward to learning so much more. So safe to say you're no longer in the military. You've transitioned out. How long has that been?
Correct. So I joined in 2000 and I retired in November 2020. So 20 years to the month.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's exceptional. Thank you very much. So you credit your graduate education as being and maybe I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so please correct me if I do, but Afrocentric leadership and lifelong learning. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think I'll start in the Afrocentric leadership part. So when people think Afrocentricity, sometimes you think it's it's pro-Black, it's anti-this, anti-white. Whatever the case may be. What Afrocentrism does, it just centers our story. And so it talks about the unique history of African peoples throughout the diaspora. And the diaspora is, starting in the continent and as we moved out over time. And it really focuses on things, principles. So self-determination, cooperative economics, mutual responsibility, things of that nature. And so it just taught me that what I was taught was different than what we're taught in school. In school, our history starts at slavery. When we come across, they might talk about some kingdoms in Africa or Egypt, which is part of Africa. But when you get into Afrocentricity, you start to talk about all the great things people of African descent did. And some of that involves suffering, especially throughout the transatlantic slave trade and whatnot. But it really instills a sense of who you are. Because we always say in our community, we use the term Sankofa. And Sankofa basically says you have to know where you're coming from in order to understand where you're going. And that's what Afrocentrism does to someone like me. It centers my history.
That is very cool. And I love that concept. Say that again. You have to know where you came from.
Yeah, you have to know your past to know your future. So you have to know where you came from to know where you're going. right? Because sometimes if we don't have that solid foundation or moral compass, I call it, we can get lost and chewed up in this world.
And, in this job, I am constantly learning. And so it does strike me as, I often think about sort of the knowledge and the history that we learn about slavery as a separate entity from what I've learned about Africa. And so I think it's so important to understand, and I thank you for sharing that those two sort of, one graduates into the other, and they are connected in such a large way. I don't want to change topics, but I think we're going to get into this a little bit more as we talk a little further. But I do want to find out, sort of going back in your life a little bit, what made you decide to join the military?
You know what? It's actually a funny story. So I've had people in my life that have been in the military. So before I was born, my father and my uncle were in it. But one day I was working since a young age. My mother was the only one that worked at the time, and I have two sisters. So, there wasn't much money flowing in our house. And so at a young age, I delivered papers. And one morning I'm delivering the paper and I look, and there's this guy on the front, and he's out in the woods, out in the field, as we'd call it, in the middle of winter, sitting on something, and he was eating what we call ration packs, right? And I'm like, I'm freezing right now in the middle. It's 6 a.m. I was like, I can do that, right? And so, I didn't really want to go to work at a fast food restaurant. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just said, let me give this a shot. And it was really that picture of this gentleman who kind of became a mentor of mine, that got me involved, and I thank him for that all the time.
So you went and spoke to him that time when you saw him?
Yeah, so I ran into him and I was like, what's this military thing? The Army's like, oh, you can do this, you make this amount of money, you get to go blow shit up, do all these cool things. And I was like, that is for me. And so in the Combat Engineers, that's what we do, is we assist friendly forces, like building bridges, but we also, help defeat the enemy and blow holes in the ground and use C4.
So you got to.
So that's what I credit my friend for getting me into it.
Well, that's fantastic. And so, did you end up spending a lot of time with him during your service, or were you guys separated?
I did, but he was a few ranks higher than me, so we weren't like buddy in while in uniform. But once we took the uniform off, we had a lot in common. One, we were two of very few Black people on one of the biggest bases in our country. And we're also from the same community. So we kind of had a little bit of connection with that. So
I wonder what would have happened if you had not run into him. Do you ever think of that? Do you think you would have graduated to the military?
Well, I have thought of it because I've experienced it. I'm always grateful for him, but because he was so much higher than me, we never spent a ton of time together. So more often than not, I was the only person of color in my section or in my platoon, right? So, I've had experiences, kind of being the only person in the room that looks like you.
Yeah. So that kind of leads to my next question, which is just wanted to find out a little bit more about your experience during your services, like responsibilities, your advancement, friendships. And I guess, what was that experience like to be the only Black person in the entire, not just the room, but the entire base?
It was tough. It's not something I often thought about because I always focused on the work, like always trying to be the best I could be. Because if anybody was going to knock me, I felt like I had to be the best I can be because I've had all these other things going against me, right? So, you get certain comments and things of that nature. So I was like, well, I'll prove you how good I am through my work ethic. And because of that, I made some good friendships. I had the ability to travel. And so with the engineers, what we did, we did a lot of explosives work. So much of our work was in CFP Gagetown, which is in New Brunswick. But I was lucky enough, I should say fortunate enough to play basketball on our national military team.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
That took me to all over our country, playing basketball and meeting some unique people. So the military has been good in that respect in terms of opportunity, professional growth, learning how to be uncomfortable, all right, which is a skill we could all get better at.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a little bit about that. So lots of traveling, lots of unique experiences, some not so healthy. And, when you think of, racist attitudes or sexist attitudes or things of that nature, they can have lasting scars in individuals. And I think for me, through, some good cognitive behavioral therapy, I've come to find out that, sometimes people only see things from their point of view, right? And I often use this saying like training, and it says, we see the world not as they are, but as we are. Right. And if you think about that, you realize that when people make judgments on you, they're making it from their own perspective, and it really has nothing to do with you. Right. And there's a lot of power in that. And so I've transferred that into my teaching.
I have a family member who's very conscious of what all the neighbors might think. And I'm always like, they're probably not even thinking about you at all. Like you're not the center of their universe just because, you happen to be there. But people are so hung up on their history and what's taught them to think about what others think of them. And I love that concept, that the way our worldview is, and it's almost like something to keep in mind whenever you're forming any kind of opinion on anything, is that, okay, what view is this? This is my worldview. This isn't coming from the world. This is the way I see it. And so I need to maybe change the way I see things if I'm going to actually look at this in an accurate light. Would that be safe to say with what you teach?
100%. It starts with ourselves, right? Ourselves. Like we have this idea that, it's everybody else's job to fix us and teach us. Like we have to be the ones that are open to learning and growing. And then take that learning and growing and bounce it off our lived experience, right? And see where the gaps are.
Yeah, well, it takes a lot of insight to be able to do that. Not all of us are ready or prepared to do that. So you're now an entrepreneur. And so can you tell us why you decided to start your own business versus, working for another large organization or going into security or some of the sort of expected / traditional roles that a lot of the military, I don't know if they choose or if it seems to be a path that is put in front of them. But why did you choose entrepreneurship?
I think that's an amazing question. And because I realized in the military what I didn't want to do. And like subordinates and taking orders is great, but then you realize like people behind the ranks, they're people. And without that rank structure, they're just people. And sometimes you're like, especially if they're rude about the way they treat you and stuff like that, you're like, this may not be for me, right? But the other thing is I've done a lot of teaching in the military. So, I used to travel around and do a lot of explosive theory and, just being in adverse situations constantly. So for me to get up in a room full of people, I don't get super uncomfortable as much as I used to. So it's just kind of transitioned in from that, I would think.
And so did you have a chance to speak and train on anti-racism or any of that area when you were in the military? Was that a focus of any of the training that you did, or was it more specific to blowing shit up?
Yeah, a little bit of both. We did SHARP training, sexual harassment and racism prevention training. But honestly, it was my own personal will to learn and grow, to address my own unconscious bias, to learn about that phrase I just told you. We see the world not as they are, but as we are. And so for me, it's really about that emotional intelligence part. Okay. There's 4 domains: self-awareness, self-regulation, I think empathy and social skill. And so for me, I'm big on the self-awareness part, right? Which is the ability to recognize my own moods and emotions and how it drives my behavior. Because that is everything. If you can control that, then you can control potential outbursts or, how you treat other people instead of flying off the handle. You realize that everybody's got their own stuff, right?
Exactly.
And so
exactly.
That's really what I hone in on in every part of my life, actually, even as a parent and as a husband.
And that's really hard to do. I have a background with a lot of trauma as a child. And so I've had to learn through therapy and including EMDR therapy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it was a miracle worker in my life. But every time that I would feel those same feelings and emotions that back during the trauma, it changes your chemical makeup and suddenly you start to respond the same way that you did during the trauma, which doesn't serve you well anymore. And it's hard work to recognize that you're even doing that in the first place because you feel like, well, I'm upset and this is for good reason. And the reality is you're upset because you're almost like a little child back in that spot where the trauma happened. And so I congratulate you for doing that because it's been a long road for me to do. And I know that it's hard work. And so that's excellent. Do you think that your time in the military and I think you've kind of answered this to a certain degree, but did it affect your decision to start a business, and also the type of business that you've started? Was that sort of a driving force for you?
I think it was a catalyst. Again, like I knew I didn't want to, you know, I don't mind working for others because I've done it my whole life. But my wife runs a small business, and I worked in that for a number of years, and I love that idea of autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so autonomy with service is like gold to me. And so like I have my autonomy, but I also have the skill set to provide service to people. And so I guess it's similar to the military because I was providing service. I was constantly learning and growing, but I like the private world because it's less rigid. Right. And so what I've learned in my time is to approach things with the soft skill and not necessarily the hard military skill that I used to look at the world. Right. I'm kind of more of the soft skill, like empathy, relationship building, trust, self-awareness, all those types of things. And I honestly think it's part of my own healing.
Yes.
I think it's part of my own healing because, I always said, like, I never wanted to fight fire with fire because people would expect that. So what do I have to do is I have to educate myself, right? And then present this material in a way that's digestible, but people can learn because I present a safe space.
And I love the way that you speak so far, and also when we spoke when we first met, in such plain language, because often we get into the lingo of the whole space, and then it becomes almost you have to be in the space to be able to really understand what's being said. But the way you communicate everything is done so plainly, and I think that's very, very important for all of us to learn, and also be able to accept it without feeling as though we have to know all of these phrases and acronyms and big words. And so then we feel like we're kind of missing out. And I think that's a real niche that you've got there. It works fantastic for those of us with disabilities as well, because we do like to have the plain language, and it sinks in a lot more easily. So with your recent releasing from the military, what was that transition like? How did that go for you?
It wasn't that bad. I feel like the veteran support was good in terms of like people checking in. The administrative like leaving or retiring wasn't nothing. I was ready. Like it took me more time to actually make the decision than it did do it because I loved where I was at, but my family, I was just too busy. And so I wouldn't say it was laborious or painful or anything like that.
Well, that's excellent. Not the experience of everyone, of course. Do you think that it makes a difference? And this is just your opinion. Where someone is in the military when they transition as to where they wind up in civilian life, does it make a difference?
I think so. So I'm from a smaller place in Eastern Canada, and if I was maybe in a more populated center where transition services were more robust, and there was different opportunities for people to transfer into civilian career with minimal hoops and hurdles, I think that would have been beneficial because none of that stuff's offered like where we're from, right? Or if like the programming's not right in your face as if I was in Ottawa or if I was in a bigger major center.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. So your business currently specializes in helping working professionals develop, but you also have experience as an academic advisor, and I guess both of those roles provide guidance. But do you approach them differently in how you work with working professionals versus students? And tell us a bit about the academic work that you do. I'd like to hear more.
So the question is no. I treated both people. But treat them the same because my goal is to help people. I want to add value and solve problems, right? And for me, that makes me happy. So those things together, it's like when people ask what's happiness, I say, helping people while pursuing your goals, if that makes any sense. And so for me, I've kind of treated them similar. Mind you got to be considerate of age appropriateness and where they are in their journey, their life's journey. But in terms of academic advising, I do a lot of listening. Because, I've learned that sometimes we can be interrupters, right? So someone's telling you something, you go, oh, wait, and you try to fix it for them. Mm-hmm. And I was an interrupter, I'll admit it. But now I listen And I have a little formula I use to ask certain questions to get certain answers. And it's a coaching technique I use. And it just allows them to kind of solve their own problems as opposed to me trying to fix it for them. And that is where the learning is. And so when I do presentations, and if I am lucky enough to have enough time, I do breakout space where adult learners can get together and digest the material collectively, as opposed to me just talking to them. Because as you're probably aware of, there's multiple means or multiple ways to learn, right? And I consider that. I do incorporate UDL and things of that nature when I teach.
What's
Universal
UDL?
Design for Learning. UDL.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons we do this podcast, is because there are many ways that people learn, and maybe you can learn every way, but some ways you learn better than other ways. And so for us, we wanted to be able to share our message about supplier diversity, but also veterans and folks with disabilities in this format as well. So I love that thought, and because we support folks with disabilities, again, we're always trying to figure out different methods to be able to help people understand and learn. So and I like that approach. So what would be some of the presentations that you would do? Like what topics would they involve?
Topics. Well, there's lots of them, but the ones off the top of my head that I'm really focused on are, of course, the self-awareness piece. I talk a lot about like leadership theories and styles. What is EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion? What are they, and how do they show up in our daily lives? Resilience, development of core relationships, unconscious bias. What is it? How did it originate? And how does it show up in our daily life? And then, of course, there's microaggressions attached to that. I do anti-Black racism. I also talk about the different types of racism and the history of racism, the history of the legacy of slavery. Talk about colonialism. And with the diversity piece, like it's important, like it's more than just race, right? It's gender, it's sexual orientation, it's age, it's where you're from, your socioeconomic status. Like there's so many things to discuss with that. So I leave no stone unturned. And every session I teach normally goes in one way or the other, because normally a participant will identify with something. And then, if we want to go down that rabbit hole, we do, because that's where the learning happens.
And so does it wind up in some really stimulating conversations? I mean, are there big, conversations that happen? Do people get angry? Do you have to, I just want to sit in and hear everything you have to say, especially after you've described all that. But I'm so curious to know what types of results and responses you've had from people over the years.
So I think a good facilitator can manage rabbit hole conversations, right? Like we can go down, but we got to stick our head up. And so I always prelude every presentation with difficult conversation, right? Like trigger warnings and things of that nature. And so do people get upset? Yes, I've had tears. Yes, I've had people, and I don't want to say get upset, but be emotional, right?
Okay.
And what I like to see is when the greater group recognizes that vulnerability and says, hey, thanks for sharing. Like, it's okay, I felt like that.
And do you see that in your experience with working professionals as much as you do with students? My sense is students would be more willing to do that group acceptance, but I may be wrong.
Actually, the adult learners, like the professionals, are surprising, especially the ones that are into lifelong learning and they get it. Like, no one knows everything. And so when we're in an environment where we can learn in a safe way, it's those professionals, especially like leaders. I find they're the most talkative, because they're the ones, one, they're not afraid to speak first, right? And two, they lean into the discomfort of the conversations, especially if they can read the temperature of their staff, right? And so I find the leaders are the ones that are the most engaged, I guess we'll say.
Okay.
Right.
And have you found circumstances where you were presenting in front of people who were sort of mandated to be there and maybe not happy to be there, and so there was reticence to take in what you say?
Well, I always tell folks, like, I would never mandate this work. because I call it like leadership development. And I don't like, oh, you have to do this, because when you tell an adult they have to do something, normally they turn on the off button. It's like,
Right.
So framing it is one part of it. But not to my knowledge, not to my knowledge. But I have had circumstances where people walk in and I know they don't want to be there. Right. Probably for those reasons you just mentioned. But by the end of it, they're the ones that are talking, and then their feedback forms are really good. And I was like, wow, like, and they're the wins. Yeah. They're the wins for me, because I got to that person.
Yeah. In another life, I worked, and we would refer to that person as the heckler in the crowd. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones that are probably looking for the most attention, in my experience. And so when you include them and ask their perspective and opinion, often they're so belligerent, they're not used to people asking them to share their opinion, because they're always willing to do it so readily anyhow. And I find that really helps to bring people around. So I guess you've got sort of that same experience where they get that inclusion, and next thing you know, and once the hecklers come around, then they heckle on behalf of you, right? Then you're the biggest ally. So
yeah, I don't mind hecklers. It's about including them, because again, they're acting that way for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Right? Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm so enjoying this conversation. And so when it goes offline, I would love to find out how I get to be part of some of these presentations and hear what you have to say, if that's possible. So during your time in the military, and also in academia and as an entrepreneur, have you noticed changes in how discrimination is addressed?
I think it depends where you're at in all three of those circumstances, but I do feel that it's not addressed adequately, because sometimes it's not even noticed. So when you think about discrimination, like, there's different forms. There's individual, like interpersonal. You say something to someone, it is what it is. There's the systemic part of it, who makes more money, who makes, wage parity, gender parity in terms of salary. But then there's the bias part of it. And that's where you see like the microaggressions and things that are kind of not on the surface. And they live in all of us, actually, these, what I call, little mind traps. Like, and so I would say we like to think we address it, but it's so permeated in our society. Sometimes it's hard to see unless it's overt.
What's an example of a microaggression that you've run into?
Oh, I've actually had some perpetrated against me. So let's just define it. So an unconscious bias or a mind trap is a little, it's something that lives deep down in your brain, unless it's brought to the surface through fear or you're being scared. Sometimes they just lay dormant, right? But sometimes they bubble to the top and they come out in subtle ways. And so, for an example, so I call a microaggression a small, normally unintentional act of aggression. So one time I was in my office and I got a phone call from a lady. She wanted to bring her son in to talk about some programming. I was like, sure. This is as a student advisor. And so when she came to my door a week later, because I set up the appointment with her, I said, hey, welcome to my office. I'm Brad. And she looked at me. She said, oh, you speak different. You didn't sound like the person on the phone. Now, can you spot the microaggression there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the assumption is I was going to open the door and be like, yo, what up, baby girl? Welcome to my office, because I'm a person of color, or have some like broken English or something. And so the microaggression here is that she says, I speak good. What she's really trying to say is you don't sound like what the black people on TV or the black people.
And also she doesn't speak good.
Yeah. So
when she says I speak good.
Yeah, so I've had that happen before. And women have this, like, microaggressions. Like, for example, I've been in spaces where we're taking notes and, like, the pen's kind of thrown down to the, the female in the room to take the notes, right? Like, that, even though it's overt, some people don't see that. I see that as, like, what?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. They wouldn't want me to take the notes because no one can understand much of what I write. In fact, lots of times I can't. So
scratch that.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering as we get, because so many things have happened recently in the last few years, and I don't really want to name all of them, but we know that there's so many things that have happened that have really brought racism to the real forefront of things. And so I just wondered if you've seen sort of more of a positive move in terms of how discrimination is dealt with since then, because I mean I sort of see it, but I'm not looking at it from the same mindset or lens that you are. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Is your experience getting any smoother in that area, or is it sort of stagnated, stayed the same?
I think that voices are being heard and that people are starting to understand that injustices exist. I think that's the first step. Um, and so, it's ironic you're asking me this because I have a family friend who lives in a predominantly white neighborhood. He's Black, his wife is white, and they have two visibly Black children. And their house got egged the other night, and they kind of know who's did it. And so, yes, overt acts exist. And with the age of social, too, it's a little bit different because people can be a little bit more subtle and, on their cell phones. But would I say it has lessened? No. Would I say it's more people are more conscious that it exists? Yes. Especially in the interpersonal, more, out there aspects. But again, it's the unconscious bias part that people aren't understanding yet. And the thing is that we all have it. We all have these little ideas or stereotypes about other people. It's just we never think about it. Like, where do they come from? Why do I think like this? And that's what I get into, the self-awareness piece.
I have these kinds of conversations with my mom all the time, and so she will say that she's not racist, and yet I say I think we all are, Mom. I don't think we can help it because that's just the way that our society has been designed, and I don't want to say it's okay to be racist, but it's okay to recognize, I guess, that you have the ability to be racist because all of these things have taught you to be that way, sort of inherently, and it's on us to. So anyway, it's a fun exercise that the two of us do because she's in her mid to late 70s now, and so this is sometimes a difficult conversation for her to recognize. Oh my goodness! And then when you see the light bulb come on, so we really enjoy it. But I also kind of explore too, and it's discrimination of every kind, and not necessarily just based on people's skin color that we kind of explore together. And so it's just very fun conversations, but it is so deeply ingrained into our lives here in Canada and specifically in North America that we don't even understand when it's happening. So what advice do you have for listeners who want to address their own biases?
Again, it starts with self-awareness. And I know that sounds cliche, but it really starts with recognizing and understanding your own moods and emotions and how they drive your behavior. Not only recognizing them, but recognizing where they come from. Is it a nature thing, like you're born this way, or is it a nurture thing? Are you conditioned through where you grew up, the media you consume, your friends, the people you admire, all of those types of things?
And I guess maybe to learn to admit when you're wrong. And do better once you know better would be something I would try to do. So what advice do you have for people who are seeing biases in others around them? Like, how do you suggest they address that, or should they even address that?
That's a very good question. And so when we think of witnessing something and not doing anything about it, we call that a bystander, right? Someone that speaks up for another group, speaks up and not over another group, we call them allies. And so for allies, if they want to address something, like a comment made by somebody, the first thing they want to do is pause. Did I hear that? The second thing you want to do is acknowledge or ask and say, excuse me, did you just say what I think you said? Right? Acknowledge, get them to acknowledge it, ask them the questions. The next is to listen for that response. And then the last part is to speak your truth. Give them a chance to say, hey, I didn't mean it like that, or it came out the wrong way, or yes, I meant it. And then you speak your truth.
So pause for a second, confirm that that's indeed what they did say. Ask for, did they really mean it, for sort of clarification on what they're saying? And then based on that response, then speak your truth.
That's it.
Would you speak it either way, whether their response was positive or negative?
100%. 100%. Yeah. And so that's a tool. That's a tool from, oh, it's called PALS. I think it's from the University of Michigan. They have a really good,
Okay.
PALS. I think it was called PALS. And that's where comes from.
Yeah, that's a very good technique. I'm going to implement that myself. Sometimes we're at the end of our time now, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. And like I said, I want to learn so much more from you. But sometimes I ask people at the end of our podcast if I presented to you like a genie in a bottle and said, "Okay, you get one wish. You only get one. I'm taking the other two." What would you wish for in terms of let's stick with Canada in terms of Canadian society as what would be your sort of what would be your wish to try and make things better from a discrimination and racism perspective in Canada? What one thing?
I
If
would
somebody could just
say
put that down and
that's a
hand
big
it
one,
to
but
you.
I would say less polarization and seeing difference as an asset.
Oh, yes. I love that. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that is fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today, Bradley. I really appreciate it. And thank you for just like taking a chance and being on the podcast, even though we hardly even know each other and only met in the one conversation. So I really, really enjoyed having you here and I appreciate all that you've shared with us.
Thank you so much for your time and thank you for your work.
Thank you. And thanks again for joining us today. So for more supplier diversity content, check us out at iwscc.ca. You can find us on YouTube, listen to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. There's new episodes every month and a lot more going on with our organization. So follow us on social media. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.